There are many elements within the filmmaking process, and all of them play a crucial role in what we perceive to be an engaging film or video. But the one thing that we absolutely can't do without is light. But how do we know where to begin? How do we go from this to something like this? The truth is, there is a whole lot to learn in the world of lighting. But what if I told you that there are simple but super effective ways that will get you from point A to point B and getting you that quality cinematic look? And the best part is, you can do this too. So let's get into it. Hey, what's happening? My name is Ryan, and if you're new with us, welcome. I truly appreciate you being here. Over the years of my career, I've learned a lot about lighting and cinematography, but that wasn't always the case. There was a time when I would just bring in lights just to bring them in and call it a day. But I quickly learned that the way you light a scene can have a direct impact on how the viewer perceives the events that are happening within your story. In the early days, I wish I had somebody to help me understand all of this, so I thought I would share a few simple things that I like to think about in every single video or film that I make to help you close that gap. And the first thing is motivation. Now, we've talked about motivation quite a few times here on the channel, but basically what it is just walking into a room and finding the ambient light that is spilling in the room naturally, as well as shadows that fall into the scene naturally. Then you just use things like lighting sources and negative fill to accentuate those highlights and shadows or to enhance them. One of the simplest ways to do that is to just find the main light source, whether it's a window, a floor lamp, a street light, or whatever it might be. Then just match the same direction with your studio lighting as your lighting source. This will not only illuminate your subject's face, but also light up your subject in a natural way, and your shadows will also too fall in a natural way, making this look a little more realistic. And I talk a little bit about this in one of my last videos. I'll link that up if you're interested in learning more, but this is just the beginning. Your lighting source will also have its own color temperature. If it's daylight, it'll usually be somewhere around 5600 Kelvin. If it is a floor lamp or a table lamp, it's gonna be somewhere around 3200 Kelvin. If it's candlelight, it'll be 2700 Kelvin, and so on and so forth. But then there's all the abstract lighting sources that might be out there. You want to motivate your lighting to whatever that lighting source is. So after that, you're gonna want to know how soft or hard your lighting is. If it's gonna be a table lamp, it's gonna be much softer than, say, direct sunlight. Another thing to think about, and something that I didn't actually think about in the beginning of my career for a very long time, is brightness. How bright you have your light source is really gonna sell what's happening within the scene, but depends on the style and what's happening within the story. But that actually brings me to my next thing, and that is to light your spaces. A lot of people on YouTube say light spaces, not faces, and I totally agree with that, but I would argue that both are just as important as the other. Lighting your subject's face is gonna allow us to see their emotions and to see what's going on with the scene. Lighting the space is gonna help to sell that scene. So going back to motivating our light, if there is a window in the scene, then we need to light the space to look like it's being lit by that window. If there's a lot of window light within the scene, that becomes much harder to light the space, because now you have this massive light source that you kind of have to battle to make sure you're not blowing out your highlights, but also lighting up the entire scene. So what do? For me personally, I just bring in a couple of 300 watts or 200 watt, and I point them at the ceiling and usually light up the space that way. Most of the time, I don't need anything that massive though. If I'm filming a night scene like this scene here, I'll just use a tube light and point that up in the air. That spills down from the ceiling, and voila, you got your fill light. Lighting up the space to match the lighting that's going on within the scene is super important, because it's gonna help to sell whatever's happening within that scene. And just to further illustrate this, this is what this scene looks like without the space being lit. In the background, just our subject, and as you can see, it doesn't look as well lit or natural, and so we add some lights in to give it more of that natural feel that we're looking for. But moving on to something that can totally add more atmosphere to the scene, and that is accent lighting. Ambient light doesn't usually have a specific direction, and it's usually gonna be a softer lighting source, whereas accent lighting is usually gonna be a harder lighting source, and it's usually meant to highlight a detail or a character within the scene. We could use this to highlight the character's expressions or even highlight where they're going. and you could also use this to highlight an object within the scene, and you could use it to give more context and to set the tone of the scene. This is definitely one of those elements that you could do with or without, but I truly believe this is something that adds a whole lot more to the scene, making it a whole lot more interesting and keeping your viewer's eye on what's important within the scene. But after all of this is dialed in, then we go into our next step, and that is backlighting. Backlighting is super important for getting that 3D depth in a 2D format. Most of the time when we're creating a scene, we're trying to create something that has a lot of depth, a lot of texture, making it feel like we're there with our characters. And the best and easiest way to do that is to backlight. A lot of people say shoot on the shadow side, which is absolutely true. It's a very easy way to remember to backlight your subject. Just always remember to shoot on the shadow side. But it doesn't even have to stop there. You could add in negative fill to subtract some of the lighting, and you can even completely backlight your subject altogether. All of these have a different meaning and they're gonna feel different to the viewer, so definitely keep that in mind when you're using some of these techniques in your next film or video. But all of that actually brings me to our next step in the whole process, and that is choosing the contrast ratio. We've talked a little bit about this on the channel before, but contrast ratio is essentially choosing how much of a stark difference do you want in your highlights and your shadows. Less of a harsh difference in your highlights and shadows makes a lower contrast ratio, whereas more of a stark difference in your highlights and shadows creates a high contrast ratio. And then there's everything in between. Choosing this is really important because this is what's going to convey to the viewer what's happening within the scene and how they're supposed to feel about what's happening in the scene. All of the different elements that we talked about here in this video work together to convey that message, but this is one of those final steps that really pushes it just a little bit further. Hey, Future Ryan here, and once again, I completely forgot something, so here we go. Picking the right contrast ratio just depends on what the story calls for. For example, if it's a very dark room with only a few lights on, or you're trying to build suspense or mystery, then you would probably go with more of a higher contrast ratio, which is more of a stark difference between your highlights and shadows. If you are going for something a little more bright and warm and happy, then you might want to go with a little less of a contrast ratio, and so on and so forth. Picking the right contrast ratio, just like everything in your lighting and everything within the filmmaking process, has to all come down to what the story is calling for and what you want your audience to feel in that moment. And this is something that I really wish that someone would have taught me from the beginning, because it's a really fun way to utilize your lighting to tell the story and push the narrative along. Lighting is one of the most crucial things that you could learn for enhancing your videos, and all the tips that we learned in this video are a surefire way to getting you that cinematic look you might be looking for. But the number one thing that's gonna set your work apart from all the other filmmakers out there is you. Your unique view of the world and your experiences are all gonna be reflected in the work that you create. So as always on this channel, I just wanna encourage you to take these tips and techniques and practice them often and just keep making films, because you've got this, friend. Well, that's gonna do it for me. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. If you liked this video or you learned something, please click the like button down below. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, friend.